Hello, thanks for joining me to learn more about the Crystal Valley Parkway and Old Lanterns Parkway pedestrian crossing assessment. I'm Jacob Vargish, the town's Transportation Planning and Traffic Engineering Manager. After a public open house in February, the town agreed to do an engineering evaluation of the new pedestrian crossing at Crystal Valley Parkway and Old Lanterns Parkway. The report attached to this webpage provides the details of our findings and the recommendations we've made. I wanted to talk about how we made our evaluations and some of the key findings. First, we did a detailed site evaluation of all the signage, sight lines, and accessibility of the crossing. After we measured the time it took each person to cross, we used the 15th percentile to determine what the minimum crossing time should be and increased that time by 7 seconds. This allows time for vehicles to yield and for pedestrians to start crossing. The crossing time is now 30 seconds. We also found that the push buttons were not optimally placed on the crossing side of the signpost. These have now been adjusted. We've also mounted an additional sign to remind pedestrians to make sure vehicles are yielding prior to starting their cross. While state law requires vehicles to yield while a pedestrian is in the crosswalk, it is good common sense to ensure that a vehicle sees the pedestrian and is in the process of yielding and stopping prior to stepping out in front of the car. In our site evaluation, we also noticed that some landscaping in the westbound direction was blocking the visibility of a pedestrian waiting to cross. We've worked with the HOA in Crystal Valley to adjust these plantings to ensure the best visibility of a pedestrian wanting to cross. For the second part of our evaluation, we observed and monitored the actual use of the crossing by pedestrians living in the neighborhoods. We installed a video camera device on one of the streetlights and recorded all the activity over a 15-hour period. From this video, we're able to count which hours of the day were busiest for pedestrians, how long it took them to cross, and determine whether there was some additional circumstance like pushing a stroller, walking dogs, or if they were running. This was all able to be tracked. We found that a majority of pedestrians pushed the button to activate the beacon, and in the 4 cases that the button was not pushed, 3 of which had no vehicles in sight or on the approach while they were crossing. Using the busiest hours of pedestrian activity, between 5:30 and 7 p.m., we found that there were over 200 vehicle gaps between each vehicle in which a pedestrian has the time to feel comfortable to cross. National standards say that you need at least 60 gaps per hour to ensure pedestrians have enough time to access and cross the road. The third part of our evaluation was to observe and monitor driver behavior with 4 different demonstrated pedestrian behaviors that we as staff emulated. The 4 behaviors that we demonstrated were A pedestrian waiting on the face of the curb, facing traffic ready to cross, like you might if there was no pedestrian beacon available. B, a pedestrian waiting on the roadway, off the curb and next to the travel lane, again facing traffic and ready to cross. And C, pushing the button to actuate the beacon and waiting to cross. And D, lastly, we had a pedestrian holding a high visibility flag above their head, symbolizing they were ready to cross. What we found is that if a pedestrian waited on the curb or even on the road and was waiting to cross, the yield rate was 1/3 to 1/2 of the time for the vehicle. And if a flag or the button was pushed, which provides a greater visible indication to drivers that a pedestrian is ready to cross, the driver yield rate was 80 to 92%. A yield rate of over 90% is highly effective, and we were very pleased to see this kind of driver behavior. Based on these evaluations, the recommendations we're making at this time are to improve the sight lines in the westbound direction by working with the HOA to adjust the plantings. We also adjusted the beacon flashing duration to give more time for pedestrians wanting to cross. And we adjusted the buttons and put up signs reminding pedestrians to wait for vehicles to yield prior to crossing. Due to the observed speed of vehicles in this section, which is greater than the posted speed limit of 35 miles an hour, we've worked with Castle Rock Police and the section of the municipal code that allows for us to create a speed-sensitive safety zone, which means an additional $100 fine could be applied to any ticket for speeding through this area. While we don't like having to add additional punitive measures, we think it sends a clear message that the speed limit in this area is strictly being enforced. We found that a significant majority of the pedestrians are using the push button and using the crossing properly. Drivers, on the other hand, were less so, and that any opportunity to improve education and enforcement of driver understanding to comply to state yield laws is important and needs to continue to be done by our police department, town staff, and HOA communications. Lastly, one of the recommendations of the neighborhood was to install a pedestrian bridge, a traffic signal, or a pedestrian hybrid signal to improve pedestrian crossing at this location. The Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, our national standard for reviewing and evaluating the needs for traffic control devices, does not recommend installing any of these control devices at this location due to such a low volume of pedestrians each hour and such a high number of gap opportunities for pedestrians to cross between the vehicles. We do think it is likely in the future that additional traffic control will be needed, although not in the next 3 to 5 years. That will further improve pedestrian access as well as increasing vehicle access. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about our evaluation of pedestrian safety at the Crystal Valley Parkway and Old Lanterns Parkway crossing. We welcome any feedback that you have about our results or study, or anything else that's on your mind about the town's transportation system. Please fill out the feedback form on this website or contact us directly. Thanks, and have a great day.